We might as well make a start. So we're picking up from where we left off on Tuesday. We're trying to understand why perhaps human societies created the personification of evil, most notably in the form of the devil. So we suggested that the devil clearly throughout history has existed in different forms. So what does that suggest to us? Why does the devil exist in different forms? And what can we infer from that? That there is not this singular form from beginning to end. Rather, the devil has kind of changed his form, which we're going to kind of look at. But what can that tell us? So importantly, what that tells us is that the devil concept, or the personification of evil into physicality, has evolved, meaning it's an evolved concept. The devil, the kind of personification of evil, it's an evolved concept which suggests it's a direct response to need. That we need to give meaning to the bad things that we face. So if the crops die, if there is disease and famine, then we need to kind of create meaning and provide kind of solace that why are these things happening? We need to kind of understand that. Now, last time we said the problem with the culture and values that we create, i.e. the meaning that we give to things and the meaning that we assign to things, is situational, which means it's not bound to time, place, or person. It changes. And the meaning that we assign changes. So the need to personify evil in physical form has changed. It's differed according to society. Tribes, civilizations all have kind of a different conceptualization of, in essence, this kind of evil. Now, importantly, we said that within the kind of tribal societies, before we became settled societies and formed large, complex civilizations, there wasn't that dichotomy in nature between good and bad, right? Because remember, it was a monistic understanding of nature. The gods were the agents that controlled nature. They were neither good or bad. But it was when we settled into communities, and these communities grew, that we needed moral code. We needed good and bad. Now, keeping with the Egyptian mythology, it's not just the Abrahamic tradition that has a moral code for its practitioners. Other religious systems have had detailed and complex code of practices for their practitioners. Now, if we look in Egyptian mythology, there is the Hall of Truth. So, in essence, if someone wants to be rewarded in the afterlife, then they must abstain from the kind of 42 sins within the Egyptian moral code. Now, if we look at some of these are just a few highlights. What can we infer from some of the key things that it's asking the Egyptian practitioner to abstain from? So what do they relate to?
Doing harm to people.
Yeah, so doing harm to people. So it's much more focused on your encounters and interactions with the other. It's about regulating the larger community, regulating society, how you behave with others, how you interact with others. Now, if you look at a religious system in its simplest sense defines your role with the creator or gods, right? So it's your relationship with that God and how you basically worship, practice. It's very much individualistic. But also, if you look at it, that God has to define for the human agent a purpose, which is important. Why do we need a purpose? Because we need to know what was before life and what is after life. But the religious system doesn't often end there. It doesn't just give you abstract knowledge of what is before and what is after. Importantly, it tries to create alignment with this life and the afterlife. So in essence, what it suggests is, it states that basically for you to attain, let's say, heaven in the afterlife, your actions determine what happens in the afterlife. So it's about controlling your life behavior. What you do here determines what happens in the next. So if we look at this kind of call of truth, we see a lot of the moral codes are related to things like, don't steal, don't kill, don't commit fornication. All of these things are moral codes for society. Now, importantly, why is that all needed? Is because obviously we have social relationships with other people. We don't exist in individual voids. We are part of a collective. So when we encounter the other in a large collective context like society, then what's going to happen is we're going to have disputes. It's natural. Someone might feel cheated in trade. Someone might feel aggrieved in a social interaction. So, how do we resolve these disputes? We said you need a law, but prior to any worldly consequence, like prisons and things like this, religion provided the consequence. So, religion provided a fundamental function of resolving the disputes that we had. So, this is again brought into connection with the moral code. So, in essence, you want your society to function. Yeah, this is the kind of functionist idea that society has to have balance and equilibrium. So you need people to obey the general consensus. You can't have people stealing. You can't have people murdering people. It'll be chaos. It'll be basically the strong preying on the weak. So in essence, the way to regulate relationships in society is through religious systems and moral codes. Moral codes were needed when we became settled societies. It wasn't needed in the tribal societies. So that's a key point about the construct of religion and moral codes. Are there any questions on that before we go on? Okay, so we are building to the devil, but the devil, as found in the Judeo-Abrahamic tradition, took from a lot of other influences. And we can't kind of bypass Zoroastrianism because Zoroastrianism introduced some key concepts. And in particular, it introduced the idea of the destructive spirit. Now, what's important about this destructive spirit, Ahriman, is one, it introduces this idea of alignment, a moral alignment for the individual, which I'll explain. So, in essence, what you have is two co-eternal forces. Zoroastrianism introduced the idea of absolute dualism. So you could say, the good God and the bad God, right? So this was the light, this is all that is good in the world. The bad, Ahriman, is the destructive force for all evil. So there are two aspects. There is the physical evil and the non-physical. So the physical things that are bad are like earthquakes, cancer, things that cause harm, death of crops. This is physical evil that we encounter, right? What is non-physical evil then? Sorry?
Is supernatural?
The supernatural to some degree. We're talking worldly, physical things. Yeah.
Greed?
So greed, yeah? So non-physical aspects like lust, greed, these are kind of ideas that generate, within us, yeah? So those are two aspects. You've got the physical evil and the non-physical evil, those psychological evils that kind of occur in the mind that create wider problems. All of this is attributed to the divine spirit Ahriman. Ahriman, like I said, is co-eternal, so he's just as powerful as the good God. But what significance does this have to the human agent? Well, it's about alignment. So this is a cosmic battle that's happening. The good God is fighting the bad God. And the human agent has to choose. Which side do you side with? Are you on the side of good or are you on the side of bad? So this aspect introduces the idea of a supreme evil And it introduces, Persian philosophy introduces the idea of this moral code that you have to basically make a choice in this larger cosmic battle, which again, we'll see informs a lot of kind of the Abrahamic religion. Okay, so coming to then the Abrahamic tradition. So we know that Satan is introduced in the Old Testament. We've got to be aware that in the Old Testament, Satan is not really referenced in that detail. And also, the character of Satan that we are introduced to in the Old Testament is far removed from what we perceive as the devil today. He's not this grotesque character with horns, red, the kind of the Prince of Darkness, all of that kind of narrative doesn't exist in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, we see a little bit more about the devil, but in actuality, in between the Old and the New Testament is where really the full narrative begins. So let's look at the Old Testament first. So we know that in origin, the Satan character is actually someone that does the work for God. He is an angel that conforms to what God says. Basically, he's the accuser. He tests people's faith for God. Are they worthy of God's kind of praise? And in particular, the key kind of story is, of course, the book of Job. Now, it's worth kind of mentioning in the book of Job, as we know, God is sitting on his throne. The devil comes along, and God asks Satan, how is Job? He's this God-fearing, good person. How is he? And Satan replies that basically, look, Job is good and God-fearing only because you are good to him. You give him so much. And so God says, okay, you can go and test him, torment him. But there's one condition, that you can't harm him. So the devil goes and horrifically torments Job. Satan torments him, kills his livestock, harms his children, all these horrid things. And he goes back to God, and God says, look, because Job, after experiencing all these bad things, does not forsake God, rather he stays strong with his faith. So Satan goes back to God, and God says, see, look, I told you he's a God-fearing man. And the Satan says, basically, look, he's only God-fearing because you didn't allow me to harm him. So God says, okay, all restrictions off, do what you want to him. And so Satan returns and physically starts to torment Job with all these horrific kind of illnesses and the boils and all these horrid things that Job has to then experience immense torture, pain, suffering, and he's bedridden. And even though he's going through all this torment, he does start to ask some important questions. So he asks, why does God make people suffer? And how does God know what it means to suffer? But he really doesn't understand the answers to these questions. So he simply says, look, I don't know, but I have faith in my Lord, and I only accept God. So Satan then returns, and God is angry with Satan because he said, look, you incited me against him, Job, to destroy him for no reason. So if we take just this story, this is the story of the Satan in the Old Testament, really we're not confronted with this figure that we know. So the origins of Satan being this kind of Prince of Darkness, enemy of humankind, doesn't really start in the Old Testament. It starts between the end of the Old Testament and a huge period up until the New Testament. But what is interesting, the first attempt to personify evil is not Satan. Does anyone know who the first attempt is? Yeah.
Lilith.
So Lilith, yeah? So it is alleged that basically, in the beginning, God created Adam, yes? But the first woman was Lilith. And God ordered Lilith to consummate with Adam. But she refused. She refused God's command. She rebelled against God and refused to consummate with Adam. As a result, Lilith was essentially left to wander the desert. She was banished to the desert, where eventually she becomes this vengeful spirit and the enemy of mankind. Sometimes, things like infant deaths are attributed to Lilith. But this doesn't actually take hold in society. It doesn't take hold as the personification of evil. So the first candidate for being this evil, the personification of evil, is Lilith, and it doesn't really pan out. So it comes back then to Satan. Satan is going to be constructed as the source of evil. Now, what we need to understand is, how does this come about? How does the angel, who is a disciple of God, become the prince of darkness? Now, we said possibly the fall happens in between the Old and the New Testament. To understand that, we need to know what is the social reality of the Israelites during this time. We know that basically they were under Roman occupation, and the Romans are oppressing the Israelites. They're suffering, they're in crisis, they're being tormented, tortured, they're oppressed. And so the Israelites start to ask important questions. Has Yahweh forsaken us? Why are we being tested so severely? Why are we being experiencing torment and suffering? So they need to find meaning, right? They need to make sense of what is happening, this torment that they are encountering. And so there is an attempt to make sense of all of this. And in essence, what they need to do is understand what is the source of this torment. And it cannot be God, and it cannot be humans. So they need to find an external agent separate from God, separate from humans, to attribute as the source of evil, as the personification of evil. And so what we see is Satan starts to evolve, the need of a character to personify evil. Now, if we look at the social reality, there are different phases here of influence. So you had the Roman occupation, then you had the Persians come in, and the Persians ruled with a state religion. And then when Alexander the Great defeated the Persians, you had the Greek influence. So you've got, during this period, 3 distinct civilizational influences on the Israelites. And what we find is that they drew from those encounters in creating the fall narrative and the Satan character. So the first, as we suggested, is the influence of Persia. Ahriman is this enemy of the good God. So this concept that God has a mortal enemy, equal in power to him. He is in a cosmic battle with this evil God. So this evil God, Ahriman, is at war with the good God and all the forces of good. Also, as we know, Zoroastrianism introduced the idea that there is this cosmic and moral battle, and we have to side on the side of the good God. So these are elements obviously taken in. Now, at this time, there's no real kind of concept of hell within the kind of Jewish mythology. There is an introduction of the abyss from Zoroastrianism. So Zoroastrianism brings in this idea that there is an abyss where perhaps you go when you die. So that's kind of Zoroastrianism. When the Greeks came in, when Alexander the Great defeated the Persians, you had a major influence from Greek mythology. So in particular, you've got Hades. Now Hades is often depicted in Greek mythology as being kind of black skin. So black skin, black beard. He has a 2-pronged fork, and he is the Lord or the God of the underworld, the God of the dead. So he's often seen in modern interpretations as kind of evil. However, in Greek mythology, that was never the case. He was neither good or bad. He was also the god of justice, the god of wealth. But elements of Hades are going to be adopted. Now, where does the fall narrative come from? The fall narrative is not unique or did not originate in the Abrahamic tradition. It's actually part of Greek mythology. So there is Greek mythology that suggests basically Zeus is the king of the gods in the Greek pantheon. And he's challenged by Typhon, who basically rebels against Zeus's authority in heaven. And what happens, Zeus defeats Typhon and throws him out of heaven and places him in the lowest part of the underworld, which is Tartarus. Now, interestingly, if we look at Typhon, he has a serpent kind of body, lower body. He has wings, and he's basically, there are going to be elements of him that are going to be, again, adopted and imposed on the devil. So the fall narrative comes from Greek mythology. You have Hades as well as Zoroastrianism. So we can see the initial building blocks of the devil character forming. So the kind of Abrahamic religions are taking from these influences and constructing the personification of evil, right? Now, what's missing is this conception of a kind of hell. So we said Judaism doesn't really believe in a hell to some extent. There are mentions of things. So we need to understand, where does hell come from? Well, in Greek mythology, the underworld has no fire. There's no fire in the Greek underworld. And also, when we talk about Hades, there was an important myth related to Hades. As the lord of the underworld, all kind of people, the dead bodies would come to Hades, whether they were good or bad. And often Hades was the one that judged them on whether they were good or bad, and whether you would then go to heaven and hell. So this is an important aspect of Hades, that he judges and he basically supposedly, takes the dead and the wicked. Now, importantly, we're talking about then this concept of hell. Hell, we're going to argue, is possibly a social construct. So there was no, like I said, fire in the underworld. So where does that come from? It comes from Gehenna. Now, Gehenna was a place in ancient Jerusalem. It was a huge kind of rubbish pile. You would dump all your huge kind of rubbish and materials, and it was a big pit. So it was a pit, a deep pit that was full of rubbish that would be periodically burned. And the inferno that would ensue would last for weeks and weeks. It was a huge fire that would engulf the whole pit, and it would burn for weeks and weeks. Eventually, the authorities would actually burn the dead bodies of criminals in Gehenna, in that fire pit. Now, what happens, that's the kind of Gehenna in ancient Jerusalem. What happens in time is that people start to believe that sinners, if you're bad and you're evil and you're wicked, then when you die, you go to Gehenna. You're sent to Gehenna. The sinful go to Gehenna. It becomes a kind of folk tale that, look, if your children are behaving badly, you'll say, look, if you're bad and wicked, you're going to go to Gehenna. You're going to go to this fiery hell, this fiery pit. So what we see is Gehenna is the building blocks of the hell conception within Abrahamic traditions. So now you've got all these different elements coming together. You've got Zoroastrian influence, the Greek influence, and you've got this kind of conception of fire and underworld being merged together. Okay, so really what starts to take shape then is the devil really starts to take shape at the dawn of the Christian era. Now, the devil still predominantly, at the dawn of the Christian era, exists in kind of more in the writings, but there are depictions. One of the earliest depictions of the devil is of him being this black-skinned figure with a beard. Who does that remind us of? So that reminds us again of Hades. Hades is this black-skinned figure, Lord or God of the underworld. So we can see that Hades and his depiction starts to be mapped out onto Satan. Also another important depiction, and these are depictions even mentioned, we said, in the New Testament. The dragon, the serpent, these elements are there. And often what we see is that the wings of the dragon and the talon feet of the dragon are put onto the Satan devil character, as well as he's been depicted as a serpent. What we can see in this early formation, there's not one crystallized depiction of the devil. He's not this horned, tail, red figure yet. So we can see that the early formation of the devil is occurring, and he's occurring and manifesting in different forms. So again, clear indication that the devil is a social construct because he's being formed, he's being put together in the imagination of the people. It's about trying to make it real. Remember, we said social construct is human beings trying to put something together and make it real. It requires then that kind of collective agreement. Now, really, the idea of the devil becomes solidified when we have Christianity established as the state religion. When Constantine basically establishes the church and takes authority, this is where we start to see more of a crystallization of Satan. And in particular, Satan starts to be used as a social control mechanism. What do we mean by that? That he starts to be used as a social control tool.
To police behavior.
So to police behavior, to regulate people, to inflict fear in people. So the church obviously has just formed and it's become the state religion. It straight away declares a war on heresy. And the reason for that is because the church needs to unify its power base. It needs to solidify itself. Because even though the church has taken power and becomes the state religion, there's still opposition to the church within Christianity. Christianity is not monolithic or homogeneous. There are different voices and opinions. And so the church needs to basically destroy opposition. So a good example of that is obviously in 1209, the crusade against the Cathars. This is a war, a crusade, that lasts 45 years. There's over 100,000 people killed. Now, why this crusade? Some aspects of the Cathars in their belief, they believed that there were two aspects to reality. There was the material and there was the spirit. And the material was considered impure and the spirit was pure. And so in essence, to gain alignment or become closer to God, you had to kind of shun or renounce the material, because the material would take you to, attachments, desires, these things, take you away from your spirit, take you away from God. So they felt that the material was impure, kind of created by a lesser deity or God, and you had to kind of focus on your spirit. So as a result of this belief, they advocated the idea that material possessions were evil. Now, why might that be a problem for the church, that material possessions are evil? Why does that challenge the church? Why is the church fearful of that kind of ideal? Because at this time, the church is becoming immensely powerful. It's becoming wealthy. It's building these materialistic grand temples and churches, and it's taken power and resources. So it's basically consuming this material world, which they kind of see as a kind of impure act. So the Cathars are essentially wiped out. This allows the church to kind of unify itself and destroy opposition. But another major aspect of the function of the devil is, at this time, even though Christianity is a state religion, the problem it has is that, okay, it's taken power, so it has control of the state, the church, but at the local level, pagan gods are still popular. So pagan gods are still popular. Now, why are they still popular? So obviously they're fused to utility, right? So Faunus, the god who's this horned god, basically fertilizes crops. So he's still popular. So these gods need to be basically destroyed, eradicated. So how do we do this? So what we start to see is the demonization of nature gods, local gods. And in essence, it's St. Augustine who says we need to basically depict the nature gods as demons. These are entities working for the devil. So in essence, what starts to happen is that, take for example Pan. Pan was a very banal deity. He was the god of music, the god of happiness, and really a banal entity. And the features of Pan are taken, like his legs and so forth, and horns, and they're kind of made grotesque, and they're kind of imposed upon it. So the devil and the kind of demons take the lower gods. So that basically these gods that are fused with utility are not in fact gods, but demons. So in essence, what the church is trying to do is trying to weaken the people's relationship with their gods. And ultimately what the church is also doing is creating an us versus them kind of dichotomy. So either you are with the church, who stands with God, or you're with the devil. So hence, if you don't follow what the church says, then you're basically going to be deemed in league with the devil, and we can fight you and we can destroy you. So in essence, the whole cosmic battle is important in justifying the actions of the church. There is this cosmic battle taking place, right? God has thrown the devil out of heaven. He's now become the enemy of humankind. He's building these legions of demons with him against humankind. He's fighting humankind, and he's fighting God, and he wants, human souls and all these things. So there is these elements from Zoroastrianism, obviously the Greek and other influences, that shape the devil. But ultimately, what we see, the church needs this character to, one, unify the church and the state, and also to weaken support for localized gods. So it's an important kind of aspect here. Okay, so another aspect of the devil is its function as a social deterrent. So in many ways, we said that there is this cosmic battle taking place, and human beings have a choice. They have a moral and religious choice to make. Are you going to be on the side of the devil, or are you going to conform to what God commands or what the church commands? So in essence, there is this battle for the soul, which makes basically this battle larger than life. So for the individual, it's a larger than life battle. The reason why you do good is so that basically the devil is beaten and defeated. So in essence, it connects you, who's just an individual, to this larger than life cosmic battle that's been taking place between God, or the forces of good, and evil. So in essence, it functions as a social deterrent, because bad behavior, because the church is the entity or the institution that dictates moral behavior. What is good, and what you can do, and what you can't do. So in essence, the devil is used as that mechanism to control behavior. So the devil is an important mechanism in controlling people's daily life. What they do, how they do it, it's all dictated by the church, right? Okay, so looking at the devil in literature, if we look at early literature, and in particular, let's say Dante's The Inferno, who he kind of depicts in quite vivid detail the devil. The devil is depicted as this very grotesque entity, right? So it's horns, it has has multiple kind of faces. So, for example, the devil has 3 faces. It has faces as well, and mouths on genitalia and all these different parts. Why does the devil have, faces like this all over? What is it perhaps representing?
Evil people.
So evil people, and ultimately it's that lust and gluttony and the sins that humans have. The devil has it in ample, multiplied by many. So in essence, the devil is this uncontrollable entity that just wants to consume, right? Consume souls, consume humans. And so it's often depicted in this way. That it's basically a manifestation of all these kind of evils and sins, which basically is a problem. Okay. Moving more towards kind of refinement, another aspect of the devil is the devil's shift. So in the medieval period, he's this very grotesque character. Very grotesque in his look, appearance, and it's very kind of cosmic in that it's this moral battle. But as we get more kind of towards the modern, the devil starts to shift and he becomes more of this tempter. So in the literature in Faust, or the damnation of Faust, what happens is Faust makes a pact with the devil. He gives away his soul to be able to become very kind of an expert on kind of magic and all these other areas, his knowledge. And so the devil grants him this, but he signs away his soul. So this introduces this other narrative that basically the devil can tempt you, can give you worldly, material success. He can give you all the success you want, but it will cost you your soul and eternal damnation. And there is these, again, stories that basically you have to make the right decision. So again, it's about moral alignment. Okay, so what's really interesting then is why we have this shift in the devil, the depiction. So medieval period, he's grotesque, he's this supernatural character, he's the lord of the hell, and he's this kind of demonic character, very, very grotesque. But he sheds this grotesqueness when it comes to the post-Enlightenment period. Why? Why does the devil shed the horns and the red and all this kind of horrific, grotesque aspect? Because in post-Enlightenment literature, we see that the devil actually becomes this quite refined and sophisticated character that it infiltrates the elite, the wealthy elite, and he basically tempts people. So why does, in the post-Enlightenment period, the devil shed that kind of grotesque supernatural aspect? Yep.
Perhaps there was more like prevalence and more severe amount of like corruption.
Okay, so there is that element of social corruption, and basically there's this kind of opposition towards perhaps the economic lack of fair distribution. So society is becoming more and more unequal, the wealthy are becoming more powerful. Yeah, sorry.
I was thinking that he then shed all this image of himself to make himself more acceptable.
So, okay, more acceptable, but why does he need to be more acceptable in the post-Enlightenment period? Why isn't the horns, the red, the tail, the pitchfork really going to be acceptable to the Western audience post-Enlightenment? Well, post-Enlightenment, obviously what's happened, we've kind of abandoned to some degree religion as our worldview and adopted science. So it's much more rational. It has to be much more kind of agreeable to our senses. It's harder to believe in this grotesque character. It's more kind of agreeable to deal with the devil as this psychological tempter who's deceiving humankind. So in essence, the Enlightenment period has a kind of shift in our imagination of the devil. Okay, so bring it to the contemporary. if we look at modern Britain today, what is surprising is that only 18% of the British public believe in the devil today. So that means 65% of British people flat out do not believe that the devil exists. 17% are unsure if the devil exists or not. So ultimately, only 18% of people believe in the devil. Why this huge decline over the centuries in belief in the devil?
Science and knowledge, people's understanding of religion and the world.
So the Enlightenment had a profound impact on our understanding of nature, right? The advances in technology and the advances in science basically made the natural world much more demystified. So in essence, supernatural ideals like the devil, which cannot be empirically tested. We can't take the devil and prove that it is an objective reality. So in essence, because our worldview shifts towards science as a societal level, naturally beliefs like in the devil or supernatural beliefs start to decline. So in essence, the Enlightenment and the post-Enlightenment period sees a rapid decline in the belief in the devil, which is understandable, seeing that basically science challenges any conception of kind of supernaturalism. Okay, is there any questions on that? We will look at religious decline in a lot more detail in a couple of weeks. Okay, so there is depictions, obviously, of the devil in popular culture. So you can find in different movies the devil being depicted in radically different ways. So you've got the traditional kind of red, horned, devil that's kind of evil, the prince of darkness, enemy of humankind. But then also, like say for example in The Devil's Advocate, you get this again, post-Enlightenment, very refined evil, where he's basically, I think, the head of, I think it was a law firm, so this powerful law firm, and he's risen up to a very powerful position to influence people. You see that in The Omen as well, that The Omen is basically the reincarnation of the devil, and basically it's about the devil needs to be stopped as he gets closer to power. So in the 3 Omen movies, you see his journey, Damien's journey to basically political office and becoming powerful and taking worldly power so that he can basically begin that final battle. So there is this kind of epic final battle, last stand that the devil will have with his demons against the forces of good. So again, it brings an alignment between this cosmic battle between good and evil, and human beings who have to kind of align themselves to it, right? So again, popular culture manifests it in different ways and forms as well. Now, it's worth mentioning that other religious traditions have conceptions of the devil. So in Buddhism, famously, just as the Buddha is about to attain enlightenment, Mara appears, this very devil-like character, and the purpose is to tempt the Buddha away, so tempt him by worldly things. So in Buddhist tradition, the kind of devil depiction is very much tempting you away from achieving salvation, achieving enlightenment. So it's attracting you to worldly attachments. Because the problem with worldly attachments is if you're basically attached to all these worldly things, like family, friends, possessions, the house, the phone, all these things will take you away from gaining enlightenment. Why? Because what that does is, if you're trying to attain enlightenment, you're trying to basically imagine if this is like the sea, right? There's 2 aspects to the sea. There is the active part, which is the top surface level, right? The sea is very chaotic. There's waves. It looks very much powerful, and it's active. Below the sea, what do you have? Tranquility, silence, quiet. So this is the active mind, right? The mind is always active. I've got to do this. I've got to go afterwards. I've got to pick up the kids. I've got to go pick up some shopping. I'm always active. How is that conducive to gaining enlightenment? Your whole focus is the material world, these things. So really, what this God, or depiction of, evil, is that it's trying to draw you back to the material possessions, the material ways. So it's tempting you away from enlightenment and salvation. Islam offers a very similar narrative to the Christian narrative of the devil. However, there is one exception. The devil is not a fallen angel in the Islamic mythology. What is the devil in Islam if he is not a fallen angel? So in Islam, it builds the idea that there is different dimensions. So you have earth and humans. There is that heavenly aspect, which is basically, angels. Now, why the devil cannot be an angel in Islamic mythology is because angels have no free will. So if they have no free will, they cannot rebel against God. So angels are predisposed to submit to God and obey God. So then they have a problem here, Islamic mythology. Who's the devil then? Because it can't be the fallen angel. So we need to create something else, right? So the Christian mythology is that the devil is the fallen angel. So we have to create a new entity. So they create the jinn. These are kind of supposedly smokeless entities that have free will. So the jinn can be good and the jinn can be bad. Now, the devil in Islamic mythology is Iblis, which is essentially the king or the leader of all the jinn. Now, why does he the fall narrative happen in Islam? Is basically God in heaven summons all the angels and all the jinn, and he says, I have made today Adam. I have created Adam. And he demands the angels and the jinn to prostrate, to submit to him. And basically, Iblis, the devil, refuses. And the reason he refuses is he says, basically, look, I only submit to you. I only worship you. You are the one true God. I don't worship man. Which kind of seems to make sense. But as a result of that rebellion and disobedience, you have the Islamic fall narrative. Well, so basically then Iblis is thrown out of heaven, and you basically get a similar narrative that's taken from Christianity, right? The whole, he becomes this demonic entity that's trying to tempt people away. So it's very similar. But we can see how Islam kind of creates a different dimension due to their beliefs. There is just one last aspect, which is the mythology of evil. I'll just summarize it. Evil, because we've, obviously as human agents, we've tried to personify evil throughout our history. And often we've created physical entities to represent that evil. But ultimately, what evil is it's subjective. What do we mean by that? So it's dependent on your perspective and meaning. So for example, the narrative of the wolf, the wolf is challenging the kind of human conception of, why is it acceptable for humans to kill and slay the lamb, and when the wolf does it, it's evil, it's bad. That tells you, even though they do the exact same act, right? The human kills the sheep, the wolf kills the sheep. Exact same action, yet one is good, one is bad. That tells us that evil is always subjective and dependent on your particular perspective and meaning, which means if you ever personify evil, it's a social construct. So the devil is a clear social construct. I'll end it there and we'll pick up next week. So next week we're going to look at the social thinkers. So it's an important week where we delve into the core kind of theories.